Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Matt, I'm just a dude, and today I'm going to show you how I built this wheeled concrete umbrella stand. So stay tuned. Before we get too far into this, if you can like and subscribe, it would definitely help out the channel and be greatly appreciated. Thank you. To build this, the first thing I had to do was figure out how big to build the form. I wanted it to be between 70 and 80 pounds. 80-pound bag of Saccrete takes up 0.6 cubic feet. So now we had to figure out what square area takes up 0.6 cubic feet. To do this, you take 12 times 12 times 12, and that equals 1,728. 1,728 square inches in a square foot. Now we can start playing with numbers. I ended up building this 17 inches by 17 inches by 3.5 inches because 3.5 inches is how tall a 2x4 is. So when you take 17 times 17 times 3.5 and then you divide it by 1,728, the number you get is 0.59. What that means is that form is going to use about 0.59 cubic feet of concrete in order to fill it up. So a bag of Saccrete should do it, but we want to have a little bit more of a safety net than that. I'm also going to add a 2x4 inside of the form to where I'm going to put the bolts for the wheels to go. So that board is going to end up being 13 inches long. So 13 times 1.5 times 3.5 equals 68.25. When we divide 68.25 by 1,728, we get 0.039. Basically, that board takes up 0.04 of a cubic foot. I can add everything together. Now we have 0.59 minus 0.04, which turns out to be 0.55. So a 17 by 17 by 3.5 inch form takes about 0.55 cubic feet of concrete to fill up. So an 80-pound bag of Saccrete should do that with a little bit of leftover, and that's what you want. You don't want to build a form that's going to be right on the border or need a little bit more concrete because you're going to have a problem when you start doing this. So we know that 17 by 17 by 3.5 inch form is going to use up about 0.55 cubic feet of concrete. It'll probably end up weighing anywhere between 70 and 75 pounds. So that's what I decided to build. To build a 17 inch by 17 inch box, I have to cut two 17 inch 2x4s and two 20 inch 2x4s. I use my speed square as a guide for the saw to make square cuts. I place the 17 inch 2x4s flush with the edge of the 20 inch 2x4s and use a large clamp to hold them in place. I pre-drill the screw holes to prevent splitting and secure the boards together using two 2.5 inch wood screws at each joint. I use a speed square to check the wood form and ensure it's square. Once the form box is built, I add a piece of 1/4 inch plywood as the bottom. I use 1 inch drywall screws to hold the bottom on. I put one screw in each corner and two screws along each side to hold the bottom in place. I use some caulking to seal the bottom edge and side of the wood form. This will not only seal the edge but also add a round edge to the finished concrete. The wheels I'm using are 3-inch solid casters from Harbor Freight. I'll note all the material I use in the description below. To add the bolts into the form to hold the wheels, they have to have a place to go. To accomplish this, I first cut a 2x4 at 13 inches long. I then mark a 1/2 inch from each side. I put the edge of the caster along this line and center it on the wood. I use a screw to mark the center of the bolt holes on the caster. I then use a 5/16 inch drill bit to drill these out. I don't go all the way through the board. I just drill a hole about 1 inch deep for each of the holes. I'm going to use 8 3-inch by 5/16 inch bolts to use as anchors for the casters. I coat the threads of the bolts with Never Seize and put them in the holes in the 2x4. I use Never Seize to prevent concrete from leaking into the bolt holes and drying on the threads. I welded a piece of 1/8 inch steel rod onto the bolt heads. This will help keep the bolts from turning inside of the concrete and give the concrete a little extra to grab onto. If you don't have a welder, you could either not add the steel rod or drill holes in the bolts to put the wire through, or take the bolts to a fabrication shop to have them welded. These bolts were originally used for 4-inch casters. The base of the caster was too large, which caused the bolt holes to be at the edge of the concrete, making the concrete too thin and it broke out. Mistakes were made. This is why I chose to build the second model with the smaller 3-inch casters. Once all the bolts were welded and set in place, The next step was to build the tube for the umbrella to sit in. Now this was built out of 1.5" rigid conduit, which ends up having an inside measurement of a little bit bigger than 1.5", probably around 1 5/8", which the tube fit in perfectly. I bought 2 star knobs with a piece of 3/8 inch by 1 inch thread already placed inside of them. I also purchased 2 3/8 inch nuts. These 2 nuts will be welded onto the conduit so the stars can be screwed into them to hold the umbrella in place. I cut the conduit at 18 inches long. Before cutting the pipe, I wrap the pipe with tape, which gives a guide for making a square cut. Once the pipe is cut, I use a round file to remove any sharp edges or burrs from the edge. I place a mark 3 inches from the top and 9 inches from the top. This will mark the location of the holes for the nuts to be welded on. If you don't have a welder, don't worry. You can build this out of tubing, but you're going to need something with a wall thickness of about 3/16 to 1/4 inch. I would use DOM tubing, being that it doesn't have a weld inside of it. It's got a smooth inner measurement, I guess, so it wouldn't hinder the umbrella being placed in it. It's something that has at least 1 5/8" inside diameter. Now you want to use 3/16 to 1/4 inch wall tubing because you're going to have to drill and tap this. You're not going to weld nuts on it, but you're going to take a tap and put threads in that tubing so you can screw the star nuts right in the tubing and hold the umbrella in place. Since I'm welding the nuts onto the conduit, I drill the holes with a 25/64 inch drill bit. I go a little bigger than 3/8 of an inch so it will not interfere with the 3/8 inch thread on the star knobs. I coat the threads of the star knobs in Never Cease to prevent any weld spatter from sticking to the threads. I tack weld the nuts in place and let the welds cool. Since these are only 3/8 inch nuts, I only weld one side at a time and then let them cool to prevent any warping from the heat. While I'm waiting for the welds to cool, I place the board with the bolts inside the form. I center the board inside the form, which leaves 2.5 inches on each side of the edge. I use 2.5 inch wood screws to secure the board to the form. Be sure to attach this board to the form with the screws going into the board from the outside of the form. Attaching the board this way allows the board to be removed easily if the board inside gets stuck on the bolts and needs to be like cut apart or demolished to get off. It makes it a lot easier to remove the form from that board. With the board secured in place, I use caulking to seal the edges. I go back and weld another side of the nuts and continue this until they are welded onto the conduit. The next step of this build is to place the rebar. I cut 4 pieces of 1/4 inch rebar at 15 inches long and 2 pieces at 14 inches long. Since I have a welder, I just welded the pieces together. Again, if you don't have a welder, don't worry. You can wire the pieces of rebar to hold them in place. But the way I'm going to do it, the first thing I got to do is put the conduit in the center of the form. 2 15-inch pieces went in first against the conduit. Then 2 14-inch pieces went in which butted up against the bolts. The last 2 15-inch pieces went to the far outside of the form. The only thing I could recommend to make this process a little easier is to cut a 2-inch piece of conduit and place it in the center. If you're going to wire this together, the littler piece will be less likely to tip over. Once all the pieces are tack welded together, I remove them and then spray the entire interior of the form with WD-40. I use WD-40 as a release agent so the concrete doesn't stick to the forms. I don't mean to age myself here, but when I was working in construction, we just put diesel in sprayers and sprayed the forms with that, and that was the release agent. The oil and the diesel were pretty much what everybody used. But nowadays, things have changed a little bit, and they make release agents, which I forgot to get at the hardware store, so I'm using WD-40. I heard that WD-40 works decently because of the oil inside of it, but we'll give it a try and see what happens. Once the WD-40 dries, I put 4 dobies in the form and place the rebar on top of them. The dobies are used to hold the rebar off of the bottom of the concrete. I use the smaller 2-inch dobies for this. The dobies have wire in them, which is used to secure the rebar to them. The next step is to add the conduit. I double and triple check the conduit is square to the form. I have the form on the table saw because this sits completely level on my garage floor, so when I put the form on top of it, it's at level too, which makes things a lot easier. Once I get the conduit square to the form, I weld it in place. Now it's time to mix some concrete. I use an 80-pound bag of Saccrete concrete mix. I mix it and add Saccrete charcoal concrete dye to darken the mix. Once it's all mixed up, I use a shovel to put it inside the form. I use a trowel to add concrete to the low spots in the form. Once all the low spots are filled, I take a hammer and gently, rapidly tap the sides of the form. This vibrates the form, removing air bubbles, and levels out the concrete. After the concrete is vibrated and leveled, I let it sit for a bit and then use a trowel to flatten and smooth the top. I use a corner trowel to add a round corner to the top of the concrete as well. I let the concrete dry in the form for about 48 hours before removing it. The boards remove very easily. I'm going to have to give WD-40 some credit on this. The board with the bolts in it needs to be split apart and cut in order to remove it. But once it's all removed, it's time to add the wheels. The bolts don't line up with the casters, so I use a 1/2-inch pipe to bend the bolts into place. I use a pipe to beat the casters on and then add the washers and nuts to secure the casters in place. So for about $60 initially, you get a 75-ish pound umbrella stand with wheels. My wife said it needs some things to make it look a little less homemade. So what I was thinking about doing is adding a metal piece that covers the wheels and then painting that and the conduit an antique bronze color. Again, if this video helped you out, if you can like and subscribe, it will definitely help out the channel. My name is Matt. I'm just a dude, and if I can't fix it, I'll fix it so no one else can. Thanks for watching.